I think this is more important because there are dedicated people within the Department of Justice who look into these crimes, even if it's not called terrorism. But I think being able to track it as part of a larger movement and see patterns among other terrorist groups, and so we're not talking ISIS, but maybe domestic terrorist groups like the militia movement or white supremacist groups or other groups that may be connected to these anti-abortion groups or have similar patterns or similar ways of doing things, that being able to think of it that way and investigate and not just punish afterwards, but try and figure out beforehand how to stop this. That calling this terrorism sees this as part of that larger picture and not just a one-off lone wolf.
Since you've been studying acts of violence and threats of violence against abortion providers, did you see anything in the Colorado Springs rampage that was different from what you've seen in the past?
What happened in Colorado Springs with the almost indiscriminate shooting of people at the Planned Parenthood was not entirely new, because in Boston in 1994, John Salvi went into a Planned Parenthood and a preterm within a few miles of each other, two abortion clinics in Boston, and killed a receptionist in both places and wounded 5 others, including security guard and a couple patient supporters who were there. Very similar to what Robert Deere did in Colorado. So as much as there's been violence against abortion providers in the past, and it's mostly been providers, including doctors and other staff, there have been patient supporters and security guards who have also been harmed in serious ways by anti-abortion violence, which is what Robert Deere did, because he did not kill any staff or doctors at the abortion clinic or at the Planned Parenthood, and he did not kill any patients, but patient supporters and first responders, and that has happened before.
So one of the people killed was a police officer, one was an Iraq War veteran, and one, I think, was a woman who was a full-time mother and homemaker.
Right, it's really tragic. I mean, one of the Iraq War veterans, soldiers who was with him in Iraq, said this guy survived Iraq, but he couldn't survive being here and assisting a friend to medical care, which is really a tragic way to think of it.
So you're looking at attacks and threats of attacks directed at abortion providers, and it's often not at the clinics, it's at their homes, it's on their way to work. Let's look at some of the attacks and threats of attacks on the homes of abortion providers. Before we get to the people who are living now, who you interviewed, let's look at an example from the past of somebody who didn't survive the attack. Barnett Slepian was killed in his home. David, tell us what happened.
He was cooking dinner on a Friday night. He was cooking Shabbat dinner on a Friday night in Buffalo, or just outside Buffalo, where he lived. He was an abortion provider in that area, longtime provider, very well respected. And James Kopp, who is an anti-abortion extremist who had previously shot several doctors along the Canadian-New York border in past years, used a sniper rifle and shot Dr. Slepian through his kitchen window, killing him. This happened in 1998, and this was a big change, at least in terms of the field, because the previous murders that had happened against abortion providers had happened at the clinic or at their place of work. And now this moved it to the home. Home protesting providers at their home on a Saturday or Sunday morning had been a tactic for a long time, but now the violence came home, and that really sent a new message.
One of the messages that the shooter sent, intentionally or not, is that a bulletproof vest isn't necessarily going to protect you, because Dr. Slepian was shot in the head. And you asked everybody who you interviewed for your book, do you wear a bulletproof vest? And there's a lot of disagreement about whether it's worth wearing or not. Can you talk with us a little bit about the responses you got on the question of bulletproof vests?
Sure. One of the abortion providers we talked to, who we identify in the book as Christina Romero, most of the providers we interviewed, we use pseudonyms for reasons related to the violence, right? They don't want their identities public. Described the memory of Dr. Slepian's death, encouraging her to weigh whether to carry a bulletproof vest. Let me quote what Christina told us. She said, I think you can wear a vest, but most of us now think that they're just going to shoot you in the head. Unless they're shooting from a distance or something with a pistol, they're going to walk right up and shoot you in the head.
That's chilling. David, what about the people you spoke to about the decision whether to use a bulletproof vest or not? Because some people are using it. Some abortion providers are using those vests.
We asked everyone about bulletproof vests and guns, and the answers we got varied, but everyone had thought about it seriously because of this risk. And I think one doctor that we interviewed really captured sort of the disconnect between asking medical care providers who are not in a war zone, they're not related to the police, about bulletproof vests and guns. This is from a doctor named that we identify in the book as Kevin Bohannon, and I'll quote from him. If anybody told me when I was in medical school that I would go to work armed and with a bulletproof vest, I would have thought they were nuts. But I do have a bulletproof vest, and I do go to clinics armed these days. And I must say that when we would read that quote to people 6 months ago, a year ago, they might have thought we were a little crazy to include it. But I think Colorado Springs really drives home what this doctor is talking about. That even though these murders and these extreme acts of violence are thankfully rare, they still happen enough that they put this fear in the minds of all abortion providers. And it's something they have to live with and deal with on an everyday basis and make their own personal assessment of risk.
And speaking of assessment of risk, the person you just quoted carries a gun. And does he carry it at all times?
He didn't say he carried it at all times, but he did say he carries it to and from the clinic. And especially when he gets out of his car to walk to the clinic and then has it on him, he also sometimes actually walks from his car to the clinic with armed guards with him.
My guests are David Cohen and Kristen Connon, authors of the new book Living in the Crosshairs, The Untold Stories of Anti-Abortion Terrorism. We'll talk more after a break. This is Fresh Air.
A softer stance on Syria, where the U.S. is no longer seeking so-called regime change.
Together, the United States and Russia have an ability to be able to make a significant difference here.
Secretary of State John Kerry goes to Moscow with some new ideas about Syria, or is it a possible concession to Putin? That's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
If you're just joining us, I have two guests, David Cohen and Kristen Connon, and they're the authors of the new book, Living in the Crosshairs, The Untold Stories of Anti-Abortion Terrorism. They're both lawyers. David is a professor of law at Drexel University, and Kristen is in private practice. Now, another issue that you raise with the interviewees who are abortion providers is threats to their children, threats to their spouses, threats to neighbors. Tell us about some of those threats and how the abortion providers have dealt with those threats.
It's really one of the saddest parts of the stories here, which is that abortion providers' families get dragged into this in ways that really seem, I mean, all of this should be out of bounds in normal political discourse, but then going after providers' kids or their elderly parents, that should absolutely be out of bounds from a normal political discourse. But we heard these stories repeatedly of providers who have kids in school, so the protesters show up at the kids' schools with signs indicating that this particular provider is a murderer. And no one really knows why these protesters are at the school other than the provider, but that's the message. I'm going to protest your kids, so you better stop. We also heard stories from people who said that their parents, who don't live anywhere near them, would receive hate mail from anti-abortion extremists. And again, that sends a couple messages. One, I'm really going to put pressure on you. But two, I know where your parents live. And right now I'm just sending them hate mail. But who knows what's next? And again, I come back to the violence in the past, because if the violence hadn't happened in the past, it would certainly be scary to send hate mail to parents. But knowing with the history of violence that has happened in this area, when your parents start getting hate mail and they know where your parents live, especially if your parents live nowhere near you, that's upping the fear level even more.
So abortion providers are trying to protect their personal information so that the extremists can't get access to it. How are they trying to protect their personal information?
So providers go through great lengths. A lot of them talk to us about not using social media, or buying a house and not using their name. The state of
Not using their name on the mortgage?
or using just buying a house but having a family member put you under their names. The state of California has a law in place that allows providers to register with anonymously. So all state records are anonymous, and only the Secretary of State keeps the provider's true name and address. And that way, the government, any government record would not have the provider's name and address. So anti-abortion activists cannot get access to it.
Is this strictly for abortion providers, that law?
No, it was originally intended for survivors of domestic violence, but it has since been expanded to include reproductive health workers, which is fantastic, and states across the country could certainly adopt something similar and should. Providers, don't talk openly about their profession. A lot of people explain to us how committed they are to the work that they're doing, and they have legal jobs, and they feel that they should be able to talk about what they do, but instead they don't because they're fearful.
At least one abortion provider who you mentioned in the book, who you interviewed for the book, was the victim of an arsonist who burned set fire to his home and to his barn. I don't think the arsonist was ever identified, but he suspects it was an anti-abortion extremist. Why does he suspect that?
The arson happened on the same day that the state where this provider worked passed a new law restricting abortion, and this provider has been vocal about it, and this law went into effect, and he had threats in the past as well, and then that day that it went into effect, his barn was burned down. Several horses and other animals that lived there were killed in the arson. Thankfully, his human family members survived. And then in the week following, anti-abortion activists took responsibility anonymously. And in fact, making it even worse, his family moved to a hotel room for a week or two, and that was vandalized as well. But what happened to this provider was similar to a lot of things that happened in this book, in the sense that it motivated him to stop being a part-time abortion provider and start to do it full-time. It made his commitment that much deeper. He knew he was at risk, but he said that what I'm doing matters and what I'm doing is important, and I'm going to now do this full-time, and he's been doing it full-time ever since.
Since there had been threats against him before, were there any legal efforts made to track down who was behind the threats?
I don't know about the tracking down of the threats, but there were efforts to try and track down the arson, but they were unsuccessful, and he thinks that part of the reason it was unsuccessful is because some of the people who were part of the cleanup crew and the fire department, after the fire was put out, had intentionally destroyed evidence because they didn't like him either. They didn't like what he was doing, and that there was intentional obstruction of the investigation in the process. And so they never found who committed this arson.
You interviewed several people who had pickets in front of their homes. I mean, picketing is, it's speech. It seems pretty benign, but when it's at your home, it's different than when it's at your workplace. How did the the abortion providers who were picketed at home, what impact did that have on them personally?
I think it has a really deep impact on providers and instills, again, this sense of fear that you're kind of not safe anywhere, that abortion opponents can find you and find out where they live. And home picketing was probably the most common form of personalized harassment targeted at a specific person. And it sends messages not only to the provider, but to the provider's immediate family or people who they live with and their community at large, that this community or this house is also not safe. And providers reflected that throughout, that their kids were fearful waking up on a Saturday morning and seeing, 40, 50 people outside camping out and yelling things at the house. And, it's terrifying for children to wake up and see that, and for families and communities to experience that.
What is the legality of picketing somebody's home?
It depends where you are. In most places around the country, picketing someone's home is legal, but there are plenty of municipalities around the country that have laws that restrict it or prohibit it entirely. And so prohibiting entirely means you just can't do it, but restricting it, we talked to several providers who had local laws that said you can't just camp out in front of one house. You have to move, say, around the block, or you have to go from one house on each side. So you can't target one house. These are purely local laws, and if there's enough of a justification for them and they are not too overbroad, the Supreme Court has said they are constitutional. Because the Supreme Court recognizes what Kristen was just talking about, which is that we go to our homes to get away for some sanctity and for some relief from the rest of the world. And that doesn't mean they're absolutely protected in all circumstances, but it does mean that the state can have a justification for limiting home picketing.
I think the main law that was passed to help protect abortion providers and patients at the clinics was the FACE law, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances law that was passed in 1994. What does that law do, and what do you think are the limitations of that law?
That law has been a wonderful law in some regards, but not very effective in others. So what that law does is it prohibits blockades of clinics and violence against or intimidation of abortion providers. It has been very successful in the first part, preventing blockades of clinics. Literal physical blockades of clinics used to be a very common tactic of the anti-abortion movement in the 1980s and the early 1990s. Not just putting human bodies in front of clinics, but putting inanimate objects that are almost impossible to move. So for instance, putting a car in front of a clinic's door, throwing away the key, locking a human being under the car, throwing away the key to that lock. How are you going to move that car away from the front entrance of the clinic? That's going to shut down the clinic. Those kind of blockades have not been completely eliminated, but they've been drastically reduced because of the FACE Act. So it's been very successful in that regard. But if you look at other forms of violence or attacks or threats against abortion providers, and you look at the numbers, it's been roughly the same before and after FACE. So FACE has been less effective with regard to the things that we talk about in our book based on our research. This kind of personal targeting has not been effectively eliminated because of this law.
My guests are David Cohen and Kristen Connon, authors of the new book Living in the Crosshairs, The Untold Stories of Anti-Abortion Terrorism. We'll talk more after we take a short break. I'm Terry Gross, and this is Fresh Air.
Family Foundation supports WHYY's Fresh Air and its commitment to sharing ideas and encouraging meaningful conversation. Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from the Pajamagram Company, offering Hoodie Footy PJs, footed pajamas for warmth and personal style, in solids, holiday prints, and Nordic fleece. More at pajamagram.com. And from Focus Features, presenting The Danish Girl, starring Eddie Redmayne, Alicia Vikander, Amber Heard, Matthias Schoenaerts, and Ben Whishaw. Directed by Tom Hooper. Now playing.
WNYC supports the arts. Join us in supporting local organizations, including the Haiti Cultural Exchange, dedicated to creating a permanent presence for Haitian arts and culture in New York City through arts presentations, performance, and dialogue. And the Pro Arte Chorale, a volunteer member chorus under professional direction, performing classic choral music throughout the New York City area. For more details about the Support the Arts program and our star partners, visit wnyc.org/star. WNYC receives support from Valorous Bull, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World. Produced by Al Corley, this theatrical event follows a contemporary philosopher's quest to answer life's big questions. Now playing at Theater Row. Tickets at telecharge.com.
You're listening listening to Fresh Air with Terry Gross on WNYC. Coming up next, it's The Takeaway on 93.9 FM, and on AM 820, it's The World.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross, back with David Cohen and Kristen Connon, authors of the new book, Living in the Crosshairs, The Untold Stories of Anti-Abortion Terrorism. It's about the attacks and threats faced by abortion providers at their clinics and homes. Cohen is a professor at the Drexel University School of Law, was the staff attorney at the Women's Law Project in Philadelphia, and currently serves on the board of the Abortion Care Network. Connon is a lawyer in private practice. She helped represent the abortion provider whose story inspired the book.